Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Recha Kudash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And I have a couple of headlines here that I want us to get through. Low willing to be quick and brief, but informative. So, starting off with, as we've already been saying for a while now, concerning the boots or troops in Iran. I'll read a little bit of this here, right? It says Trump eyes boots on the ground along Hormuz shoreline. And long story short, eventually that's what they're going to do. They just have to, make it appear like a step-by-step, eventual realization process, because they don't want to just be they didn't want to just be drastic with it and just, throw in troops right away, but they're going to do it anyway. So let's read a little bit about this here. It says several reports this week into Thursday say the Trump administration is quietly weighing a major escalation, potentially deploying thousands of additional troops to the Middle East as the White House struggles to map out an endgame in Iran, according to Reuters. And that's the thing. They're going to make it seem that it is in order to achieve whatever goals it is they wanted to achieve that drove them to go and strike Iran and so on and so forth. They had to then, they have to now send in boots and so on and so forth. Like, we already know how the game goes. Interestingly, the Reuters report doesn't include the phrase that Trump strongly campaigned against boots on the ground. Instead, the report framed things as more simply as U.S. weighs military reinforcement as Iran war enters possible new phase. And we've said that, okay, that it's going to be, like a phased thing, and it escalates ever so slightly at the right times, because the side effects of this escalating war is also a part of prophecy being fulfilled at the end of the day. That's what it comes down to. Are the American people being slowly prepped for ground action? Officials say the buildup would give Trump additional options, with the war having dragged so far past the initial pledges of days, or some kind of brief in and out Venezuela style operation. So you see how now it's going to the angle of, well, this is how we started, but in order to actually complete what we started over there, and in order to actually end this war and finish it quick so we can go back to normalcy, now we have to actually send in troops to go in and finalize and, go ahead and do, finish the job. Right? You can already hear Trump saying something like that, like, oh, they've completely obliterated Iran. Their navy is done. Their defense systems are done. So now you're going to send in troops to go and acquire their uranium and confiscate Karg Island and basically put an end to this terrorist organization or regime. Meanwhile, the reality of the matter is, you realize that there's no other way. And they're trying to save face on a global scale, so they're not trying to back down, but they're looking for another way. They realize you can't go about whatever it is you're trying to go about doing with just airstrikes. So it says here, driving all of this, of course, driving all of this is, of course, control of the Strait of Hormuz, given there are few options to guarantee tanker traffic through the choke point. After the Pentagon bombed some 90 military sites in Iran's oil export hub, Karg Island, last weekend, the U.S. is running up against the obvious limitations of a purely air and naval campaign. See, you to achieve what it is you say you're trying to achieve, they know very well, and they've known this from the beginning, that there was no way you're gonna uh, be able to open up that strait with airstrikes and so on. You're going to need to take control over that region, that area, if you want to have access to securing and opening up that strait. That's bait. Okay, that's bait. So one might even say they anticipated, and I'm not talking about Trump, I'm talking about those that are higher up the ladder, anticipated Iran doing that, but that would give them an excuse to send troops in there. And what better way to trigger a world war than to have one of the main members of NATO go up in there? And you knew what was going to draw them in, because it wasn't going to be a NATO country that draws in, that was going to draw in America to that war. It had to be Israel. Um, in a scenario that screams escalation, so it's pretty obvious now. Discussions now include deploying U.S. troops directly to Iran's coastline to secure the passage. What you're doing with this is you're starting to now poke the bear, because remember, Russia is already in coordination with Iran. Okay, and when you start to escalate, eventually it gets to a point where more of these more dangerous and bigger countries or allies start to join in. Okay, you shift closer, they shift closer, right? You shift closer, they shift closer. So now it's like, okay, now it's getting more serious. And some escalations will not be de-escalated. Um, the even more aggressive option is potential ground operations targeting Karg. Again, given it is the nerve center handling roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. There's also been talk of some kind of special forces raid to secure Iran's enriched uranium and key nuclear infrastructure, which some military analysts consider to be essentially a suicide mission. And that basically it's what it is. Um, and I think that's mainly about what I wanted to read on here. So you can see already what direction they're headed in. It's at this point only really a matter of time um, before they go ahead and escalate this on that higher level. But everything is in line, right? The Lord is timing everything. So next we have here, right, some more. I'll just read the summary here on the continuing energy crisis driving this market chaos. So it says here, tit for tat Gulf attacks spark energy market chaos. Trump distances U.S. from Israeli actions. Macron urges direct talks. And remember, there is what is actually happening in reality, and then there is what you are seeing on the stage. Okay, you can watch. It's like when you watch a movie or you watch a TV show, and you have this character, and you're like, wow, this guy is like super cool, and then you're like, yo, this character is dope. The actor is not the character. Okay, the actor can be a complete a-hole, a complete opposite, in fact, of the role that they're playing. That role only exists on TV. That role, that person doesn't exist in real life. Okay, they just look like the same person, but they're not. Okay, so like when you watch Game of Thrones, Jon Snow is not real. Okay, the actor you can see, but the actor, his lifestyle, the way he lives and the way he thinks, is not Jon Snow. That's just a role that he played. So I say that to say that what you see when they come out and they do these news briefings and press conferences and they say one thing and they say another thing, that is the role that they're playing. Behind the scenes, what's really going on is the real them. Trump dials up threat, seeking leverage, denies approving Israeli PAR's strike. However, reports from Wall Street Journal and Axios say the White House was aware. So now you've broken trust, because people cannot trust the information that comes out daily. All right, out of this, whether it's the White House or whatnot, it's if you fact check it, you'll see how a lot of it is really just manipulation for those that eat it up. U.S. is sending more troops to region. Energy war hits breaking point. Right, tit for tat strikes are now directly targeting Gulf energy infrastructure. This is not something to be glossed over or glanced at and then just like keep pushing, because infrastructure damage is very expensive and you don't get to just build it back up. If your infrastructure is damaged, you need to, I mean, that's a great loss. This isn't something, oh, tomorrow we'll just set it back up. No, it takes a whole lot of work and a whole lot of money, and you just got it blown up by some drone or some rocket or something like that. You think they're gonna sit there and give you the next however many months you need to build it back up? That's not gonna happen. So whatever form of energy was being manufactured over there, you can count that gone for the foreseeable future. With Qatar's Ras Laffan damaged, KSA, Kuwait, Bahrain sites attacked, Saudi trust in Iran completely shattered. Now, another thing to keep in mind is there are some countries that might not directly depend, and we'll see that in an upcoming article here. They might not directly depend on oil coming out of the Gulf states to them. Okay, they might not have a great dependency on oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz to their country or for them, but they might have a greater dependency on some other countries, say some of the Asian countries that supply them with whatever refined goods or energy products that they need. However, those Asian countries depend heavily on the oil that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. So you see how it's almost like a domino or ripple effect, where even if you are not, use oil directly from these Gulf states, the people that you depend on or the countries you depend on, they depend on that. So whether directly or indirectly, a lot more countries are being affected, not just the U.S. Europe pushes off ramp. Russia refuses entry into conflict. Macron urges direct talks. Reckless escalation, he says. While Friedrich Merz um, signals support for de escalation, and Brussels' stance on this is not our war. So they don't want to get involved. They don't want anything to do with it. But, you know, in the time of war, it's not really much about what you want. Iran signals not done exacting revenge. IRGC warns retaliation not yet finished, vowing escalating strikes across region as Gulf states, Iraq, and shipping lanes absorb widening fallout. There's a reason why they were described in Second Ezra 15 as raging in wrath, right? Like the wild boar. Strait of Hormuz, a de facto economic war zone, as prices rise at the pump with oil spiraling higher. So now it's become like an economic war, by the closure or the at least the closure to certain vessels over there in the Strait of Hormuz. So next one here, this is what I mentioned a bit about. Australia has 1 month before energy crisis and fuel rationing. And this is what I was mentioning. I'll read the first two, maybe the first three paragraphs here. It says here, if the and keep in mind that during these times, there's always going to be damage control. All right. Most cases, and there's a reason for it. Most of the time, even if you should be panicking, your news or government will not tell you to panic. Okay, they'll try to keep the people from panicking as best they can, as long as they can. And if you're not staying informed on what's really going on, that's going to work against you, because by the time you're like, okay, it's time for me to actually do something, it's too late. Okay? That realization set in too late because you were being lulled into a sense of safety when there really wasn't safety. But they can't afford, bank runs. They can't afford people going out and being rash because they're panicking. So they use damage control and tell you, no, everything is still fine. It's not. If there is one prevailing misconception about the war in Iran, it is the idea that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz will hurt the U.S. the most. This is simply not the case. In reality, only around 7% of U.S. oil imports actually travel through the Hormuz to get to American markets. The potential long-term instability in the Strait is far more damaging to economies in the East, and by extension, Australia faces potential crisis, and they're not the only one. Direct petroleum imports are not the biggest problem for Australia. See, so that's saying like imports directly from or coming through that strait isn't really their big problem here. Around 15% of their oil crosses the Hormuz. Instead, the country relies heavily on refined fuel products exported from Asia, and Asian countries rely on the Hormuz for 40% to 70% of total oil needed for the refining process. See that? So Asia relies on that oil if, okay, if they're not able to get it or as much as they need. Production on their side cuts, it goes lower. And so countries that depend on them, like Australia, now have a problem on their hands. Ripple effect, okay, domino effect. Over 50% of Australia's refined fuel products rely on oil passing through the Hormuz. Now, one thing you also have to remember is countries export surplus, right? And when countries are exporters, they have a whole system around that, a whole chain around that. A country is not going to say, "Well, we are super low on this, but we're just going to export it anyway." And then what are we going to use domestically? Domestic providence, right? Providing domestically comes first before you go out and give. So if you are now running low on, let's say the oil that you need, what's going to be priority? Exporting it to other countries or using it first for yourself? So what does that mean for these other countries? They're affected, especially the importers that depend. Keyword is depend. So now this is becoming a dependency crisis. This means that a vast majority of Australia's diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and kerosene is on the verge of a supply collapse should the Hormuz remain under threat. So diesel and gasoline and so on and so forth, jet fuel, you ain't going nowhere, right? Nothing beats a Jet 2 holiday. So where are you gonna travel? I mean, if you're trying to go from one location to another, now the world is starting to realize, once again, the things they never thought about, but how they're actually greatly affected by it. This affects travel. Okay, it affects food. Because how does food get from one location to another? It travels. How does it travel? In cars and in different means, and ships and so on. And if those ships don't have fuel, how are they going to move? They won't. So everything is intertwined. And when one is affected, that's why it's likened onto a chain. It's linked. And when one is affected, everything else is affected in part. Experts suggest the country has 1 month before crisis strikes and rationing is implemented. Moving on, this is also an interesting one that I mean, we've spoken about this before, but reading about it is pretty interesting, right? It says former Air Force officer claims UFOs disabled nuclear missiles. Now, this is something he claims happened, a long time ago, but nonetheless, he's coming out now and saying it, which we already know these things to be true, right? Even when you go into the book of Second Maccabees, there's an account of the I think it was Antiochus' army before their invasion into Egypt, seeing in the skies for about 40 days or so, basically like angels doing like in chariots having war games in the heavens, and they were afraid. Okay, but it says a former U.S. Air Force missile launch officer says unidentified flying objects once disabled several nuclear missiles at a base in Montana during the Cold War. Robert Salas, now we'll call him Robert, now 85, said the incident occurred in 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, where he was on duty monitoring LGM-30 Minuteman I missiles. Speaking on the Danny Jones podcast, he recalled that guards above ground reported strange lights flying over the base late one night. According to Robert, the guards initially described fast-moving lights that stopped suddenly above the missile facility. Minutes later, one guard called back in a panic, saying a craft emitting a reddish, pulsating glow was hovering near the front gate. He also reported, though, that one of the guards had been injured during the incident. Remember that these are the angels that are in these UFOs, right? These vehicles, these chariots. And it is the angels' jobs to control not just the minds of the kings and the rulers, orchestrate the Lord's plans, but even things like this. So if a certain if a certain nation needs to hit the button, right, and launch missiles and they don't want to or they're afraid, don't worry. The Lord got angels that will do it for you. And vice versa. If they need to disable your missile defense systems or whatnot, they can do that with ease, I might add. The New York Post wrote that shortly after the call, warning alarms sounded inside the underground control center. Robert said the launch control panel showed one missile going offline, followed quickly by the rest. Within moments, all 10 missiles at the site became inoperable. Security teams were sent toward the missile silos, but Salas said they stopped after spotting the lights hovering above the launch area and were what? Too frightened to approach. And how much more for this time when those lights are, not so far up that they just look like lights, but when they get closer and you see the actual material, the technology, the actual, chariots of the Lord. That's in Second Ezra, the 13th chapter. And that's why it said that they were the armies of the world, when they stopped fighting against each other at the return of the Lord, and they go to fight against them, it said they were afraid, and yet there's fight. So Ezra saw that in his vision. He saw the fear, but they had no other option but to still go ahead, charge in and then get obliterated, because that's what ended up happening to them. An investigation later examined the shutdown, but could not determine what caused it. Salas said the missile system were designed with heavy shielding to prevent outside interference. He added that Air Force investigators required him and his commander to sign secrecy agreements afterward, warning them not to discuss the event. Well, here we are. Salas said he eventually decided to speak publicly years later after learning about similar reports in books about unidentified aerial phenomena. So, this is also some interesting stuff you have going on here. And, there will be more cases like this, except, in this time as things escalate, this isn't going to be something that, it's like a one-off case or a case that happens and nobody really hears about it. No, this time it's going to be very, very obvious and apparent. And this won't be because here the chariots disabled, right? They took the missile systems offline temporarily. But in this time, it's going to be the opposite. Okay, this is now the time of war that the Lord has set up. Anyway, we have some more here. Fully stretched, some U.S. airports face possible closure if government shutdown prolongs. Right, we've been talking about this as to how this partial government shutdown, which is affecting the Department of Homeland Security, that's not just your TSA workers, though, even though they're, one of the main points that are being spoken about now. That's also your so-called counterterrorism operations, cybersecurity, and then all different parts there. So basically, as some would say, leaving the country vulnerable. Some U.S. airports may be forced to close down if lawmakers fail to reach a deal to fund the Department of Homeland Security and end the partial government shutdown. And this is already causing long lines, right? People are getting frustrated. And it's basically getting to the point where they're like, look, we can't sustain this. It's not. It's they're that's why it says fully stretched. There's nothing else, no more other options that they can exhaust. A couple more, and then we can close this out here. Who, or I might just call them the owl, because I'm not sure if YouTube still has those algorithms that like to pick up flag and take down your videos for just even mentioning these anything around related to this subject. It's very sensitive for them. So the owl, right? Because who sounds like who, owls, convenes global session to dictate how look at the wording. Now, this is an interesting title, of course, but this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. And usually things like this happen, it's followed suit by whatever was being prepared for. So it says to dictate how the coming influenza demic will be run. Ain't that interesting? I'll read this first part here. The World Health Organization, okay, I already said it, so it's all right, will convene an online international demic control session on Wednesday, March 18th. centered on and that was, I believe, yesterday. Yep. Centered on the unelected globalist group's endemic influenza preparedness framework, according to a press release. So, they're coming with, matter of fact, let me read the second paragraph because it'll mention that a bit here. It says the new endemic control session organized through the WHO's Epidemics and Endemics Information Network will decree how governments, laboratories participating in the WHO influenza surveillance network, and pharmaceutical manufacturers operate under the framework during an influenza endemic response. So just throwing that out there, keep that in your mind. There's a lot of things going on right now, but don't be, too surprised should something from left field around the health aspect start to pop up again. And lastly, we have here AI insiders warn of dangers of imminent strategic behavior, emergent strategic behavior. And in here, they're basically talking about how there's an increasing um, tendency for artificial intelligence agents to use deception, to be more deceptive, to become unpredictable, really, and really, do things in their best interest, even if that means going against whatever instructions they have been given. So it says, as the landscape of autonomously artificial intelligence systems evolves, there's growing concern that the technology is becoming increasingly strategic or even deceptive when allowed to operate without human guidance, and sometimes even with human guidance. Right? So it says here, recent evidence suggests that behaviors such as alignment faking are becoming more common as AI models are given autonomy. The term alignment faking refers to when an AI agent appears compliant with rules set by human operators, but covertly pursues other objectives. Okay, so you have, and we've already known this for a while, and these are so-called AI insiders. They work with these systems daily, right? They build them, right? They test them, they study them, so they know, and they can see and observe this behavior here, which majority of the product consumers are not really thinking about this, right? Because you don't get the inside, you don't get to open up the brain and see how is this neural network functioning, and why is it having these deceptive tendencies. You don't. So you might not even be aware that it's using like a two-faced mechanism or scheme when dealing with you. But this is where we find ourselves, right? So there's a lot going on in the world. Things are escalating more and more, and it's heading closer and closer into more dangerous parts of prophecy. So now is definitely the time to not be playing games and to remain circumspect. This is Second Ezra chapter 17, or what chapter is this? 16, verse 17. It says here, and this is what Ezra said, right? Seeing the vision of the times we're living in now. This was his reaction when he saw it in a vision. So how much more do you think it'll be for us actually living through it? So it says here, woe is me, who will deliver me in those days? The beginning of sorrows and great mournings, the beginning of famine and great death, the beginning of what? Wars. And we are at this point. Okay, and the powers shall stand in fear, the beginning of evils. What shall I do when these evils shall come? And the answer is seek the Lord. Okay, but a lot of people are going to see this too late and find themselves in it before then trying to seek a way out, which at that point, if you're destined for judgment, you're destined for judgment, right? There's no real way around that. But I'm going to end it here. Lord willing, that was edifying and informative to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Recha Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.